Don't talk to my mother like that. Edward Whitmore blinked. I didn't do anything to your mother, he said after a moment, irritation creeping into his voice. Look at her. His gaze shifted past Annie and settled again on Monica Brooks. Frankly, he added, with cool disdain, she looks absolutely shabby. Edward Whitmore seemed not to notice. He examined Monica. His eyes traveled slowly over her stall, the faded green awning above it, and finally her clothes. Her boots were worn and dusted with Georgia dirt. Her jeans were faded at the knees. Her sleeves were rolled up from long hours of work, revealing strong arms marked with small scratches. A pair of old gloves hung from her back pocket. Edward let out a quiet breath of dismissal. A place like this, he said, gesturing toward the market around him, stays exactly the way it is because people get comfortable looking like they've given up. His voice sharpened slightly. You show up dressed like that, selling vegetables from a wooden table in a dusty parking lot, and then expect people to treat you with respect? He shook his head faintly. Honestly, eating and working like this and then wondering why the world doesn't admire it, that's part of the problem. He looked Monica up and down again. People who dress that way shouldn't be surprised when the world doesn't take them seriously. Before anyone else could respond, Annie stepped forward. She stared straight into Edward Whitmore's face. You can have all the money in the world, Annie said firmly, her voice steady despite her racing breath. But you don't have the right to insult my mother. Behind her, Monica felt the entire market holding its breath. Edward studied her again. You shouldn't shout at adults, he said. Annie didn't move. You shouldn't insult people who are working, she replied. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Edward's mouth, though it wasn't friendly. You're very bold for a little girl, and you're very rude for a grown man. Edward shifted his attention briefly toward Monica again, as if Annie were merely an interruption. Well, he said with a small shrug. Someone needed to say it. Annie's hands tightened. My mom works harder than anyone here, she said fiercely. She wakes up before the sun. She carries all those crates herself. She feeds people with the food she sells. And you walk in here wearing a suit and act like she's something to laugh at? Edward opened his mouth to answer, but something about the way the child stood there so small, yet completely unafraid, caused the words to hesitate. Only minutes earlier, the morning at West End Community Market had been perfectly ordinary. Before sunrise, vendors rolled in with pickup trucks and vans filled with produce. Wooden tables scraped against the pavement as stalls were set up. Crates of tomatoes, peaches, onions, and peppers appeared one after another, the air filled with the smell of fresh earth, cut greens, coffee, and warm fruit. Neighbors greeted each other across the aisles. Morning, Miss Monica. How your sister doing these days? You get those tomatoes from Macon this week? Monica Brooks had arrived before dawn like she did every Saturday. She arranged her vegetables carefully, tomatoes stacked where the sunlight would catch their red shine. Okra placed in shallow baskets beside the scale, collard greens spread across the back of the table like dark green fans, and beside the stall sat Annie. Her small wooden stool was positioned so she could see both the vegetables and the customers. The metal change box rested in her lap like something important because to Annie, it was. She took her job seriously. She knew the price of every vegetable. She counted change faster than many adults. She kept the quarters separated from the dimes and the nickels arranged neatly in rows. Earlier that morning, old Reverend Pike had approached the stall leaning on his cane. Morning, Miss Monica. Morning, Reverend. What can I get you today? Sweet potatoes, he said. And maybe forgiveness. Annie didn't even look up from the change box. Sweet potatoes are here, she said calmly. Forgiveness is 2 stalls over. The Reverend laughed so hard he had to hold the table. That was how mornings usually went at West End Community Market. Work, conversation, small kindnesses. But for the past week, another topic had moved quietly through the aisles. Whitmore Development. Everyone had heard the rumors. A redevelopment project. Luxury shops, restaurants, and glass storefronts. And the simple truth beneath those polished words. If the land was sold, the market would disappear. Monica tried not to think about it. Annie noticed anyway. Then the black SUVs arrived. 3 of them rolled slowly into the lot. Doors opened. Men in pressed shirts stepped out. And finally Edward Whitmore emerged from the last vehicle. That's him, someone whispered from the flower stand. Whitmore walked down the aisle with 2 assistants, discussing zoning and development plans. When he reached Monica's stall, he stopped. Now Annie stood directly in front of him. Her small chest rose and fell quickly, but she didn't step back. Edward Whitmore looked down at her once more, and for the first time since stepping into the market that morning, the billionaire realized something unexpected. The smallest person in the market was the only one who wasn't afraid of him. For several long seconds after Annie finished speaking, the entire West End community market stood frozen. Edward Whitmore stood perfectly still. A young girl stood directly in front of him, small fists clenched, her eyes fixed on his face with a kind of certainty he rarely saw in adults. "You can have all the money in the world," Annie had said, "but you don't have the right to insult my mother." If this moment touched your heart, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support means a lot, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story like this. Behind her, Monica Brooks felt the entire market holding its breath. Edward studied the girl carefully. Edward crossed his arms slowly. "You speak very confidently," he said. "I speak the truth." There was no hesitation in her voice. Behind the stall, Monica placed a gentle hand on Annie's shoulder. "Annie," she said softly, "that's enough." But Annie shook her head. "No, Mom." Her eyes stayed on Edward Whitmore. "He needs to hear this." The words caused another ripple of quiet surprise across the market. Edward tilted his head slightly. "Do I?" Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." Something about the way she said "sir," respectful but unwavering, caught the attention of several of the older vendors. Edward waited. "Go on then," he said. Annie drew in a breath. "My mom wakes up before the sun comes up," she said. She pointed toward the stacked crates beside the stall. "She carries those boxes herself. Those things are heavy. I tried lifting one once and I couldn't even move it." A small laugh escaped someone near the honey stand, quickly covered by a cough. Annie continued. "She works all morning so people here can cook dinner for their families." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "And when the market closes," Annie added, "she still has to clean everything, pack the truck, drive home, cook dinner, and make sure I finish my homework." Edward listened without interrupting. Annie took a small step closer. "You walked in here, looked at her clothes, and decided she didn't deserve respect." Her gaze didn't waver. "That's wrong." Edward Whitmore held her stare for a long moment. Then he glanced around the market. He noticed things he had barely registered earlier. The worn wooden stalls, the patched awnings, the cracked pavement where weeds had pushed through over the years. But standing there now, he noticed something else too. The way Annie stood squarely in front of her mother like a small shield. Edward looked back at the girl. "You seem very certain your mother deserves respect," he said. Annie answered without hesitation. "She does, even though she runs a vegetable stall in a place that's clearly struggling?" "Yes." Edward studied her again. "And you believe that kind of work deserves admiration?" "Yes." The answer came faster this time. Annie gestured toward the vegetables laid out on the table. "People come here because they trust her," she said. "They know the food is fresh. They know the price is fair. They know she works hard." Miss Celia from the preserves table lifted her chin slightly. Old Reverend Pike nodded once from where he stood with his cane. Mr. Halverson at the honey stand folded his arms thoughtfully. Annie noticed them. She swept a small hand toward the surrounding stalls. "All these people know her." She looked back at Edward Whitmore. "Respect doesn't come from wearing an expensive suit." Edward said nothing for a moment. Behind him, one of his assistants shifted nervously. "Mr. Whitmore," the man murmured quietly, "we still need to inspect the west section of the property." Edward raised a hand without turning. The assistant fell silent immediately. Edward's attention remained on Annie. "You handle the money here?" he asked. Annie nodded. "I do the change. And you're good at it?" "Yes." Edward looked down briefly at the coins scattered across the ground. Annie followed his gaze, then crouched and began picking them up one by one. Her movements were calm and deliberate, as though nothing unusual had just happened. She dropped the last quarter into the metal box and snapped the lid shut. The small click echoed louder than expected. Edward watched her for a moment longer. Then he turned his head slightly and looked at Monica. Their eyes met for the first time since Annie had stepped forward. Monica's expression was steady. Edward nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then he turned away. "Let's continue," he said to his team. The group began walking down the market aisle again, clipboards and polished shoes moving through the dusty pavement. Gradually, the noise of the market returned. Miss Celia leaned toward Monica from the next stall. "That girl of yours," she whispered. Monica exhaled slowly. "Yes," she said quietly. Annie climbed back onto her stool and set the change box carefully in her lap. For a moment she stared toward the far end of the market where Edward Whitmore had disappeared between the stalls. "Mom," she said. "Yes, baby?" Annie tilted her head slightly. "Do you think he understood?" Monica followed her daughter's gaze. The billionaire and his team were already halfway across the lot, discussing something over a clipboard. "I don't know," Monica said honestly. Annie tapped the lid of the change box thoughtfully. "Well," she said, "I hope he did." Because something in Annie Brooks told her that the conversation between their family and Edward Whitmore was not finished yet. That evening, Edward Whitmore stood at the windows of his office and looked down at Atlanta without really seeing it. From the 42nd floor, the city always looked clean, controlled. The roads glowed with orderly streams of light. Glass towers reflected the last gold of the evening sun. Even the older neighborhoods, from this height, looked flattened into neat patches of shadow and geometry. Distance had a way of making everything appear manageable. Edward had built a life on that illusion. Behind him, the office was silent except for the low hum of climate control and the soft click of a folder being placed on his desk. Daniel Price stood waiting. Edward did not turn right away. He kept one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly against the window frame, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. For most of the day, every time he had closed his eyes, he had seen the same thing. A small girl standing in the middle of a market aisle, coins on the pavement. That voice. Respect doesn't come from wearing an expensive suit. "Sir," Daniel said carefully, "you asked for background on Monica Brooks." Edward turned then and crossed the office in a few quiet steps. Daniel had laid out a slim file, no thicker than a church bulletin. That, somehow, irritated him. Whole lives reduced to thin folders always did, though he rarely admitted it. He sat, opened the file, and began to read. Monica Brooks, 34. Single mother, resident of a modest apartment on the west side. Temporary lease. No significant assets. One child. No spouse listed. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No family wealth. Vendor at West End Community Market for 5 years. Known by other vendors as reliable. Pays late once in a while, but always pays. There was a small stapled note near the back. Borrowed vehicle for produce pickup. Works 6 days a week. Leaves market after close. Picks up child schoolwork from aftercare on weekdays. No known support system beyond neighborhood and market community. Edward read that page twice. "Who put this together?" he asked. Daniel adjusted his glasses slightly. "Our standard research team." Edward's eyes stayed on the file. "Standard. Yes, sir. Standard. Meaning efficient, cold, stripped of anything not immediately useful to business. Enough information to evaluate risk, not enough to recognize humanity unless someone insisted on looking for it." He set the file down. "And the market?" he asked. Daniel opened another folder. This one was thicker. "West End Community Market occupies the most valuable portion of the block," he said. "If acquired in full, the site would allow for continuous frontage along both primary streets. Retail projections remain extremely strong." Edward nodded once. But Daniel did not miss the fact that his gaze had already drifted back to the first file. "There's resistance from the vendors," Daniel added. "Mostly informal for now. Anxiety, rumors, some talk of petitions." "Some talk. Yes, sir." Edward leaned back in his chair. He thought of the market in the morning light, of old wood and stacked produce, of people looking at one another as if they belonged to something more binding than contract law. It had not impressed him when he first stepped into it. He had seen age, disorder, low yield, but then that child had spoken, and somehow the whole place had shifted under his feet. Not literally, of course, but enough. "You're distracted," Daniel said. It was not an accusation. Daniel had worked for him long enough to know when blunt honesty would be tolerated and when it would not. Tonight, apparently, it would. Edward let out a short breath. "Am I?" "Yes." Edward looked at him. Daniel hesitated only briefly. "Sir, with respect, most people shout when they're afraid. That girl didn't." Edward's expression did not change. No, he said quietly. She didn't. Daniel closed the second folder. She believed what she was saying. Edward looked again at Monica's file. She shouldn't have spoken to me that way. Daniel said nothing. Edward tapped one finger against the edge of the desk. And yet, Daniel echoed carefully. For a moment, the room went quiet again. Then Edward asked, "Did you find anything unusual? About Monica Brooks?" "No, sir. Other than the obvious. Which is, she works harder than most people with 10 times her resources." Edward did not answer. He returned his gaze to the window. Across town, in a second-floor apartment above a laundromat and a closed tax office, Monica Brooks was standing at her kitchen sink rinsing collard greens for dinner. The apartment was small, but clean. Annie's school papers were clipped to the refrigerator with mismatched magnets. One kitchen chair had a loose leg Monica kept meaning to fix. The linoleum near the stove had begun peeling at one corner. A pot of beans simmered low. Cornbread cooled beneath a dish towel. Through the open window came the layered sound of evening traffic, somebody laughing on the sidewalk, and a dog barking 2 buildings over. Annie sat at the table with her homework spread in front of her and the metal change box beside her like a trusted companion. Monica glanced over her shoulder. "Why is that box in my kitchen?" Annie looked up. "I'm checking it. You checked it 3 times already." "I'm checking it emotionally now." Monica had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. "Emotionally," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Monica turned back to the sink, though the smile still touched one corner of her mouth. It did not stay there long. The day had exhausted her in ways labor usually did not. Physical work she understood. You lifted, carried, bent, sorted, sweated, kept moving. The body complained and then eventually forgave you. Humiliation was different. Humiliation stayed. It sat somewhere just under the ribs and replayed itself in pieces. A glance, a tone, a sentence you wished you had answered differently. Monica had lived long enough to know that what hurt most was not being seen as poor. Poverty, in one form or another, had followed her for years. What hurt was the contempt, the assumption that hard work and worn clothes meant a smaller kind of life. At the table, Annie pushed her worksheet aside. "Mom?" "Yes, baby? Are we going to lose the market?" Monica dried her hands slowly before turning around. Children deserved honesty, but they also deserved sleep. Mothers spent half their lives choosing between the two. "I don't know," Monica said finally. "Not yet." Annie studied her face. "That man wants it," she said. Monica pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Yes, he thinks because he has money, he can do whatever he wants." Monica folded her hands. "A lot of people think money means they don't have to listen." Annie frowned. "That's stupid." Monica laughed softly then, tired but real. "Well, you're not wrong." Annie touched the lid of the change box with one fingertip. "I didn't mean to yell that loud." "Yes, you did." A pause. Then Annie gave a tiny, reluctant smile. "Okay. I did." Monica reached across the table and smoothed a loose braid away from Annie's cheek. "You cannot talk to every rude person in this world like that," she said gently. "Why not?" "Because sometimes rude people had power. Because sometimes power turned mean. Because mothers lay awake nights trying to imagine how to keep a child both good and safe." Instead, Monica said, "Because not everybody deserves that much of your energy." Annie considered this deeply, the way she considered most things. "But you deserved somebody saying something." The words landed softly. Harder, somehow, for being soft. Monica looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, "Come, set the table." Annie slid down from her chair and carried 2 plates over with great seriousness. "Mom?" "Yes. If he comes back, I'm still watching him." Monica set the cornbread on the table. "I know you are." Annie nodded once, satisfied with being understood. Back downtown, Edward Whitmore closed Monica's file at last, but not before his eyes caught one final line handwritten in the margin by someone from the research team. "Child often present at stall. Handles cash. Bright. Alert. Bright. Alert." Edward stared at the words longer than he should have. Then he stood, took the file with him, and walked once more to the window. Below him, the city glittered with all the confidence of money, but somewhere beyond the shine and height and steel, in a neighborhood his investors would call transitional and his planners would call underutilized, A woman was likely serving dinner after a 12-hour workday, and a little girl with sharp eyes was probably still deciding whether he had understood what she said. For the first time in a long while, Edward Whitmore found himself unsettled not by opposition, but by the possibility that a child might be right. The next morning, West End Community Market woke the same way it always did. Before the sun fully cleared the rooftops, trucks were already pulling into the cracked parking lot. Vendors dragged wooden tables into place, the legs scraping across pavement worn smooth by decades of Saturdays. Crates thumped onto the ground. The smell of tomatoes, onions, coffee, and damp earth slowly filled the morning air. But something in the atmosphere had changed. People spoke a little quieter. Heads turned more often toward Monica Brooks's stall. Word traveled quickly in places like this, and by the time the first customers arrived, everyone already knew what had happened the day before. The story had grown in the telling. Some said Annie had shouted down a billionaire. Some said the man had turned red and stormed off. Others claimed he'd looked like someone had slapped him with a truth he wasn't ready for. Miss Celia was retelling the moment for the third time near the preserves table. "I'm telling you," she said, tapping the lid of a jar for emphasis. That child stood there like a tiny preacher. Old Reverend Pike chuckled beside her. "Well," he said, "sometimes the Lord sends the message in a smaller package." Across the aisle, Monica unloaded a crate of sweet potatoes from the back of her van. She worked quickly, the way she always did, but she could feel the attention drifting toward her stall, like sunlight creeping across a floor. Annie noticed it too. She sat on her stool with the metal change box in her lap, watching the market with sharp eyes. "Mom," she said quietly. "Yes, baby?" Everybody's staring. Monica slid the crate into place beneath the table. "That's because people like a story," she said calmly. Annie tilted her head. "I didn't do it for a story." "I know." Monica wiped her hands on a small towel and began arranging tomatoes in careful rows. "But once something happens in a place like this," she added, "people talk about it for a while." Annie considered that. Then she opened the change box and began organizing the coins. "Well," she said thoughtfully, "they better make sure they tell it right." By mid-morning, the market had returned to its usual rhythm. Customers moved through the aisles. Conversations floated between stalls. Children tugged their parents toward baskets of peaches. The radio near the honey stand played an old gospel song, and slowly, the attention around Monica's stall faded, which was exactly how Monica preferred it. She handed a bag of collard greens to a customer and accepted a $10 bill. "Annie?" "$6.50 back," Annie said, already counting. Coins clicked neatly into the woman's palm. "You're fast," the customer said with a smile. Annie nodded. "I practice." Monica shook her head slightly. Then a shadow passed across the stall. The conversation around them softened again, not as suddenly as the day before, but enough for Annie to look up. Two black SUVs had just pulled into the lot. They stopped near the edge of the market. Doors opened. Men in pressed shirts stepped out, and then Edward Whitmore stepped from the second vehicle. Miss Celia saw him first. "Well now," she murmured under her breath. Across the aisle, Reverend Pike leaned on his cane and watched carefully. The billionaire began walking through the market again, though something about the scene was different this time. Yesterday he had walked like a man inspecting property. Today his pace was slower, more deliberate. His assistants followed a step behind, carrying folders and tablets, but Edward himself said nothing. He simply observed. He passed the honey stand. Mr. Halverson gave a short nod but did not speak. He passed the preserves table. Miss Celia met his gaze without flinching, and then he reached Monica's stall. For a moment, neither Monica nor Annie spoke. Edward looked at the vegetables laid out on the table. The tomatoes were bright in the sunlight. The collards were fresh. The okra sat neatly arranged in shallow baskets. Then he looked at Annie. She was already watching him. The change box rested in her lap again, her small hands folded calmly over the lid. "Well," Annie said. The word hung in the air. Edward raised one eyebrow. "Well," she repeated. "Did you think about it?" A faint ripple of amusement moved through a few nearby vendors. Edward glanced briefly at Monica. She remained still behind the table, her expression neutral but attentive. Then he looked back at Annie. "Yes," he said, "I did." Annie studied his face carefully, as if she were measuring the truth of the answer. "And?" she asked. Edward placed his hands in his coat pockets. "You made a strong argument yesterday." "That's not what I asked." A quiet laugh escaped Reverend Pike somewhere behind the crowd. Edward's mouth twitched slightly. "You asked if I thought about it," he said. "I did." Annie leaned back on her stool. "That's only step one," she said. Edward blinked. "Step one?" "Yes." She held up one finger, thinking. Then she raised a second. "Step two is fixing it." A couple of vendors exchanged glances. Edward looked at the girl with something approaching curiosity. "And what exactly do you think needs fixing?" Annie pointed toward the vegetables. "You judged my mom without knowing anything about her." She pointed toward the surrounding stalls. "You judged this whole market without knowing the people here." Her voice remained calm. "That's bad math." Edward tilted his head slightly. "Bad math?" "Yes." Annie tapped the change box. "When I count money, I have to see every coin before I decide the total." Edward watched her for a moment. "And you believe I didn't see everything? You didn't even look." The words were spoken simply, without accusation. That somehow made them land harder. Edward glanced around the market again. The vendors weren't pretending not to watch anymore. They were watching openly now, waiting. For a long moment, Edward Whitmore said nothing. Then he reached toward the stall and picked up one of the tomatoes. He turned it slowly in his hand, examining it. Perfect color, firm, fresh. "How much?" he asked. Annie answered immediately. $2. Edward pulled a bill from his wallet and placed it on the table. Annie opened the change box. "No change needed," he said. Annie closed the box again. "Okay." Edward looked at the tomato one last time. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "Maybe I didn't look closely enough yesterday." Annie nodded once. "That's what I said." Edward set the tomato back on the table, but he didn't leave. Instead, he remained standing there, as if the conversation wasn't finished yet, and Annie had the distinct feeling that it wasn't. Edward Whitmore did not leave. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Men like him were supposed to move through places like West End Community Market the way weather moved through briefly, decisively, without becoming part of anything. They arrived, evaluated, and went on to rooms where decisions were made over polished tables and filtered water. They did not stop at a produce stall after being corrected by a child and stand there as if the conversation still belonged to them. But Edward stayed. The tomato he had almost bought sat where he had set it down, red and unbothered in the morning light. Annie kept both hands on her change box and watched him the way a school principal might watch a student who had already lied once and was being given exactly one chance to do better. Monica did not speak first. She had long ago learned that silence, properly used, could force a person to reveal what they had really come for. Edward glanced from Annie to Monica, then to the vegetables arranged across the table. "These are yours?" he asked. Monica folded a paper sack for a customer and nodded. "They are. You source them locally?" "Some. Some from a distributor south of the city. Some from a farm outside Macon when the price isn't too high." Edward absorbed that. "And this stall supports both of you." It was not phrased as a question, but Monica answered anyway. "It does." A woman waiting to buy onions shifted her purse higher on her shoulder but made no attempt to leave. Two men near the honey stand stopped pretending they were interested in bees. Edward slipped one hand into his coat pocket. "How long have you been here?" 5 years. "And before that?" Monica handed the woman her onions, named the price. Waited while Annie counted back change, and only then looked at him. "Before that," she said evenly, "I was working somewhere else." Edward's face revealed nothing, but Annie noticed the question still sitting behind his eyes. "My mom's not applying for a job," Annie said. A few people nearby smiled into their collars. Edward looked down at her. "No," he said. "I suppose she isn't." Annie lifted her chin. "Supposing correctly is better than talking wrong." This time the laugh that moved through the nearest stalls was impossible to hide. Even Monica had to turn slightly, pressing her lips together for a moment before facing forward again. Edward's expression altered by the smallest degree. Not a smile. Not quite. But something in him had adjusted. Before he could answer, old Reverend Pike appeared at the edge of the stall with his cane and his usual timing. "Morning again," the Reverend said, looking from Monica to Edward to Annie, and then back to the Collards. "I seem to recall I came here for sweet potatoes, but I may stay for the character development." "Reverend," Monica said. A warning threaded lightly through the word. "What?" he asked, offended only in the theatrical sense. "I'm old. I've earned the right to observe." Annie nodded solemnly. That's true. Edward turned toward the older man. You've been here long? Reverend Pike adjusted his hat. Long enough to remember when this lot was mostly gravel and 2 folding tables. He tapped his cane once on the pavement. Long enough to remember who sold out, who hung on, who buried spouses, who raised children from behind these stalls. His gaze sharpened, long enough to know there's more here than square footage. The words did not sound rehearsed. That was probably why they landed. Edward said nothing. Miss Celia, who never missed an opening once she believed she had moral permission, called from her preserves table. This market kept half this neighborhood fed in '08 when folks were losing homes and pretending they weren't. She straightened a row of jars. Ain't no shopping center ever done that. Mr. Halverson from the honey stand joined in without looking up from his labels. My wife sold candles here after my pension got cut. He shrugged, the movement careful with age. Helped us keep the lights on 2 winters. The woman who had just bought onions tucked the bag under her arm and added, Miss Monica brought vegetables up to my sister when she had surgery and couldn't drive. Monica immediately shook her head. That was nothing. No, the woman said. It wasn't. Edward stood in the middle of it, hearing not a protest, but a testimony. There was no chanting, no signs, no public relations strategy behind it. Just ordinary people stating plain facts in ordinary voices, which somehow made the defense of the place feel more serious than outrage would have. Annie watched his face. You see? She said quietly. Edward met her eyes. I'm listening. Annie considered him a moment, then nodded once as if marking a small point in his favor. A pickup rattled past the outer fence. Somewhere down the row, a toddler began crying over a dropped cookie. The market, sensing it had made its point for now, slowly resumed its movement. But the energy around Monica's stall stayed taut. Edward looked across the aisle, at the line of old tables, the patched canopies, the handwritten signs listing prices in thick black marker. He saw what he had always seen before. Age, inefficiency, low-margin trade. But now those things were layered beneath other facts he could not as easily dismiss. Longevity, memory, interdependence. People whose lives were stitched into the place in small invisible threads. Daniel Price approached from a respectful distance, holding a tablet against his chest. He read the scene in one glance and chose his tone accordingly. Mr. Whitmore, he said softly. The zoning consultant is waiting by the south fence. Edward did not turn. He can wait. Daniel nodded once. Annie noticed that too. Edward looked at Monica again. You've heard about the redevelopment. Yes. And you know why investors want this block? Yes. Then you understand this market sits on valuable property. Monica's face did not change. Property is valuable because people give their lives to it. It was the kind of sentence a person could only say if she had earned every word of it. Edward's eyes held hers a second longer than before. Annie felt the current in that silence, though she did not yet have the language for it. Then Edward said, There are plans to modernize the area. Miss Celia snorted from across the aisle. That's a pretty word for pushing old folks out. Daniel glanced toward Edward, waiting to see whether he would object. He did not. Annie swung one foot once beneath her stool. When grown-ups say modernize, she said, it usually means somebody else is about to have a bad day. Several heads turned toward her. Edward looked down. You have opinions about a great many things. Yes, Annie said. That saves time. He almost smiled again. Almost. Monica reached for a basket of okra and began restacking it. With respect, Mr. Whitmore. Whatever happens on paper doesn't happen on paper for us. It happens in rent, in food, in whether my daughter has a place to sit while I work. Edward's gaze shifted to Annie's stool, then to the change box in her lap. The box was old but polished by use along the edges. Her thumb rested possessively over the latch. She always comes with you? He asked. Most Saturdays, Monica said. I help, Annie added. I can see that. It was not said unkindly. That, more than anything, made Annie narrow her eyes. She had already decided kindness from him should be verified, not assumed. A voice rose from farther down the aisle, Mr. Jenkins from the bread table calling out prices on fresh rolls. The smell of coffee drifted through again. The market pressed on, as markets do. Even while lives stood at the edge of being altered, Edward turned slowly, taking in the people around him one more time. Old Reverend Pike with his cane, Miss Celia with her preserves and sharp mouth, Mr. Halvorson with his honey and his pension stories, the woman with the onions, Monica behind her vegetables, Annie guarding a metal box like the whole moral order of the world might be stored inside it. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed just slightly, less declarative, more careful. "This project," he said, "is bigger than one stall." Reverend Pike answered before Monica could. "Every injustice says that." Daniel looked down at his tablet. The sentence settled over the space between them. Annie leaned forward. "Then maybe," she said, "big things should learn how not to crush small ones." No one laughed that time. Edward held her gaze, and something in his face became unreadable even to himself. Then he gave one short nod, not agreement, not yet, but acknowledgement, and stepped back from the stall. "I'll be in touch," he said. "With who?" Annie asked immediately. Edward looked at Monica. "Your mother." Annie considered that, then said, "You should also talk to people who don't have office chairs." Daniel looked down very quickly, as if hiding a reaction. Edward did not answer. He turned and walked away down the aisle, Daniel falling in beside him, the other men hurrying to catch up. This time, as he passed the neighboring stalls, people did not look away. And this time, he noticed. Annie watched until the black SUVs pulled out of the lot and disappeared beyond the fence. Then she looked up at Monica. "He's still thinking in rich people sentences." Monica let out a breath that was very nearly a laugh. "Maybe." Annie tapped the lid of her change box. "He better think faster." Miss Celia called over. "Baby, you keep talking like that and he's going to need a whole second childhood." Reverend Pike nodded. "And possibly Sunday school." The market laughed then, the sound easing some of the pressure that had been sitting on everyone's chest since yesterday. Monica shook her head, but this time she let herself smile. Still, as she turned back to her vegetables, her eyes drifted toward the lot where Edward's vehicles had been. The smile faded, because now the danger felt clearer, not smaller. The market had spoken. Annie had spoken. And men with power did not always like being told the truth in public. At the far end of the city, in the back seat of a black SUV, Edward Whitmore sat in silence. While Daniel reviewed figures he was not hearing, he could still see the stall, still hear the old man saying there was more there than square footage, still hear the child saying big things should learn how not to crush small ones. For the first time in years, a piece of land no longer looked simple to him. By Monday morning, the story had spread far beyond West End Community Market. Stories had a way of traveling faster than truth. But in this case, the truth was already dramatic enough. By the time the week began, people across the neighborhood were repeating the moment in their own versions. A little girl had stood up to a billionaire. Some said she shouted him down. Others said she embarrassed him. A few said she had reminded him how to behave like a human being. At the small barber shop 2 blocks from the market, the television above the mirror was playing a local news segment. The reporter stood in front of the familiar wooden stalls. Residents are raising concerns about a proposed redevelopment project that could replace the long-standing West End Community Market with a commercial complex. Behind the reporter, the camera caught glimpses of vendors setting up tables, customers browsing produce, and the old green awning over Monica Brooks's stall. In a nearby diner, 2 construction workers watched the segment while eating eggs. "That the place?" one asked. "Yeah," the other said. "My aunt buys vegetables there every week." "And that kid really yelled at the rich guy?" "Apparently." The man shook his head slowly. "Good for her." Across town, inside the glass tower of Whitmore Development, Edward Whitmore watched the same segment in silence. The television hung on the wall of the executive conference room. Around the long table sat 6 investors. Their suits were immaculate. Their expressions were not. A woman with silver hair and sharp eyes leaned forward slightly. "This is becoming a problem," she said. Edward remained seated at the head of the table, hands folded calmly. "It's a local story," he replied. "For now," another investor said. He tapped a tablet screen. "The clip already has 200,000 views online." Edward's assistant Daniel stood quietly near the wall, observing the room. The silver-haired woman spoke again. "Our timeline for the redevelopment cannot afford public resistance." Edward said nothing. Another investor sighed. "Edward, this market is sentimental for people. You know how these things go. If protests start, the city council slows down permits. Zoning hearings drag out for months. And suddenly, a 2-year project becomes 5. Edward leaned back slightly in his chair. We haven't submitted final plans yet. That's exactly why we should move faster, the man insisted. The room waited. Edward's gaze drifted briefly toward the television again. On the screen, the camera showed Monica handing a bag of collard greens to a customer while Annie sat beside the stall counting coins in her metal box. The reporter's voice continued. Many community members say the market represents more than just a place to buy food. For some residents, it represents history. Edward picked up the remote and muted the television. The silence that followed felt heavier than the report itself. Edward, the silver-haired investor said, her tone firm. This project is worth $30 million in projected revenue. He nodded once. I'm aware. We didn't buy half the block to preserve a vegetable market. Daniel watched Edward carefully. After several seconds, Edward spoke. Public opinion matters. The room went still. It matters when it threatens profit, the man across the table replied. Edward didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window. 40 floors below, Atlanta moved with its usual restless energy. Traffic flowed through intersections. Pedestrians crossed streets with coffee cups in their hands. The city never paused long enough for any single argument to matter very much, except sometimes it did. Behind him, one of the investors spoke again. The girl is becoming part of the story. Edward turned slightly. How so? The investor held up a tablet. Social media. He turned the screen toward the room. A photo filled the display. Annie sitting on her stool beside the vegetable stall, the metal change box in her lap, staring directly at the camera with the same fearless expression she had given Edward 2 days earlier. The caption read, "The bravest voice in Atlanta." Edward studied the image for a moment. Then he looked away. "This is temporary attention," he said. The silver-haired woman folded her arms. "Attention is exactly what we don't need." Edward returned to the table. "We continue as planned," he said. The investors exchanged glances. "Then we move forward with acquisition?" Edward paused. Only for a second. "Yes." Across town, Monica Brooks was unloading crates from the back of her van again. Monday mornings were quieter than Saturdays. But the small weekday version of the market still opened for regular customers who preferred fresh vegetables over supermarket aisles. Annie sat on her stool with the change box open, carefully stacking coins. A man approached the stall holding his phone. "Miss Monica," he said with a grin. "You seen this?" He turned the screen toward her. The same photo from the news story filled the display. Annie blinked. "That's me." "Yes, it is," the man said. "You're famous now." Annie frowned. "I didn't want to be famous." Monica wiped her hands on her apron and looked closer at the phone. The caption made her stomach tighten. "The bravest voice in Atlanta." Annie leaned forward to study the image. "They took that without asking." "That's what cameras do sometimes," Monica said quietly. Another customer approached. "I saw you on TV this morning," the woman said to Annie. Annie sighed. "I just wanted him to stop being rude." The woman smiled warmly. "Well, sometimes that's exactly what the world needs." Monica finished stacking a basket of tomatoes, but as the morning continued, more people stopped by the stall. Some bought vegetables. Some just wanted to meet the girl from the story. Annie tried to stay focused on counting change, but she noticed something unusual. People were watching, not just out of curiosity, out of hope. Around noon, Reverend Pike arrived with his cane and a knowing look. "Well," he said, glancing around the busier-than-usual stall, "looks like you started something." Annie looked up. "I didn't start anything." The Reverend chuckled. "Child," he said gently, "sometimes truth starts things, whether we mean it to or not." Across the city, Edward Whitmore sat alone in his office once more. Daniel entered quietly with a tablet. "Sir," he said, "you should see this." Edward glanced at the screen. Another article had appeared online. The headline read, "Atlanta market faces demolition, but one young voice is fighting back." Edward leaned back in his chair slowly. For the first time in years, a redevelopment project had become something unpredictable, not because of lawyers, not because of money, because of a small voice that refused to stay quiet, and Edward Whitmore was beginning to realize something dangerous. The more people listened to that voice, the harder it would become to ignore it. By Tuesday afternoon, West End Community Market felt less like a neighborhood market and more like the center of an argument the whole city had suddenly decided to join. People still came for tomatoes, collards, onions, and sweet potatoes. Older men still leaned on folding chairs and offered opinions nobody had requested. Miss Celia still arranged her preserves with the precision of a museum curator. Reverend Pike still bought one thing and stayed to discuss five. Life, in its practical details, continued. But under all of it, something had changed. More customers came with phones in their hands. More strangers stopped to look at Annie before they looked at the vegetables. More conversations began with, "Are you the little girl from the news?" Annie had already grown tired of that question. "No," she told one woman dryly, handing back 3 quarters and a dime. "I'm the little girl selling okra." The news part was extra. The woman laughed, bought 2 pounds of tomatoes, and left shaking her head in admiration. Monica kept her face composed through all of it, but the attention sat on her nerves like a weight she could not shift. Public sympathy was a strange kind of comfort. It came with warmth, yes, but also exposure. And exposure was dangerous when powerful people were involved. That afternoon, just after lunch, the market was full enough that the usual sounds had risen again. Vendors calling prices, customers comparing peaches, someone dragging a crate across the concrete, the old radio crackling under a weather report. Monica was weighing bell peppers when a woman in a linen blouse and dark sunglasses stopped at the edge of the stall. She was one of those people who always looked as though they had stepped out of an air-conditioned car and never fully entered the weather. Her handbag was expensive without shouting about it. Her nails were neat. Her perfume arrived half a second before she did. She smiled at Monica in a way that was meant to seem friendly. "Well," she said, glancing over the stall, "I suppose this is charming in its own way." Monica kept bagging the peppers. "What can I get for you?" The woman picked up a tomato, turned it in her fingers, then set it back down as though she had decided not to trust it. "Nothing today," she said. "I was just curious. I saw the story online." Annie, seated on her stool with the change box in her lap, looked up at once. The woman's eyes drifted over Monica's shirt, her worn jeans, the dirt still caught near the seams of her boots. Then she sighed lightly. "It really is a shame," she said. "A pretty face can carry a lot, but not forever. You'd think women would know by now that if they let themselves go, the world notices." The words were delivered softly, almost lazily, as if cruelty spoken in a pleasant tone somehow counted as advice. Monica's hand stopped on the edge of the scale. Around them, the air changed. Annie looked first at the woman, then at her mother. She saw it immediately, the small shift in Monica's eyes, the practiced smile that didn't reach them, the quiet tightening at the corners of her mouth. It was the same look from the day Edward Whitmore had first stopped at the stall. The same hurt, forced inward before anyone else could see it. Annie slid off her stool. She did not shout this time. That was what made the moment sharper. She walked around the side of the table, stopped beside her mother, and looked directly at the woman in the sunglasses. "My mom did not let herself go," Annie said. The woman blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Annie's voice remained calm. "She is working." The woman gave a short, awkward laugh. "Honey, I was only saying—" "No," Annie said. The single word cut through the excuse before it could finish forming. "You were being mean." A few customers nearby went still. The woman glanced around, suddenly less comfortable than she had been 10 seconds earlier. "I wasn't being mean," she said, smiling tighter now. "I was trying to help." Annie's expression did not change. People say that right before they say something ugly. Somewhere behind the stall, Reverend Pike made a sound that might have been a cough and might have been the effort of not laughing out loud. The woman straightened. "Well," she said coolly, "children shouldn't interrupt grown folks." Annie folded her arms. Grown folks shouldn't act ugly in public. There was no laughter now, only silence, because Annie's voice, small as it was, had gone beyond sass or cleverness. There was something painfully clear in it, something old in the way children who watched too closely sometimes sounded old. Monica set down the peppers slowly. "Annie," she said, but Annie kept her eyes on the woman. "You looked at my mom's clothes," she said, "and decided you knew what kind of person she is." The woman opened her mouth. Annie went on. "She gets up before morning. She carries heavy boxes. She comes home tired and still makes dinner. She helps people. She works all day." Annie paused. "That is not letting yourself go." That is taking care of your life. The market had gone quiet again. Miss Celia stopped in the middle of wrapping a jar. Mr. Halvorsen looked up from his honey labels. Two younger men near the bread table turned completely toward the stall. Annie took one small breath. My mom isn't less because she looks tired, she said. She looks tired because she does more than people like you. The woman in sunglasses had lost all trace of ease now. Color touched her cheeks. I think this child is being extremely disrespectful, she said, glancing toward Monica, as if expecting the mother to step in and restore a social order that no longer favored her. Monica met her gaze. No, ma'am, Monica said quietly. She's telling the truth. That did it. The woman gave a short offended laugh, turned, and walked away faster than dignity usually allowed. The silence she left behind held for half a heartbeat. Then Reverend Pike exhaled loudly through his nose. Well, he said, if I were her, I'd keep walking until I hit Alabama. A ripple of laughter moved through the market. Soft at first and then fuller. Not mocking so much as relieved. A pressure valve releasing. Annie looked up at her mother. Was I too much? Monica stared at her for a long moment. Then she reached down and touched Annie's cheek. No, baby, she said. You were exactly enough. The words landed harder than Monica intended. For a second, Annie just looked at her. Then, satisfied, she nodded once and went back to her stool. Customers resumed moving. The radio resumed crackling. Somebody asked about sweet potatoes. Somebody else laughed too loudly at Reverend Pike's Alabama remark. Life closed around the moment and carried it forward. But the moment did not disappear. It moved through the market. It settled into memory. And, because the world now insisted on recording everything, it traveled farther than that. A college student near the flower stand had captured most of the exchange on her phone. By 4 o'clock, the clip had spread online. Not Annie shouting. Annie speaking, calm, direct, clear. My mom isn't less because she looks tired. She looks tired because she does more than people like you. By 5, the video had made its way into inboxes, text threads, social feeds, neighborhood groups, and eventually onto the desk of Daniel Price. Edward Whitmore was in his office when Daniel entered without his usual small talk. You need to see this, Daniel said. Edward looked up from a draft acquisition timeline. Another article? Daniel handed him the tablet. Edward watched in silence. He saw the woman at Monica's stall, saw Monica's face close itself politely around insult, saw Annie step down from her stool, heard the child defend her mother not with noise this time, but with moral precision. He watched the clip once, then again. When it ended, the room stayed very quiet. Daniel did not speak. Edward set the tablet on his desk, but not before the paused image fixed itself in his mind. Annie beside her mother, one small hand on the edge of the stall, looking at the world like she expected it to answer for itself. At last, Edward said, Who was the woman? Daniel glanced at the screen. I can find out. Edward looked toward the window. Below him, the city was beginning to light up for evening. She said Monica had let herself go, he said, more to himself than to Daniel. Daniel waited. Edward's voice, when it came again, was quieter. No, he said. That's not what that looks like. It was the first time he had spoken of Monica Brooks without contempt, and Daniel noticed. By Wednesday morning, the story no longer belonged to the market. It belonged to the city. News vans had started appearing 2 blocks away, careful not to crowd the narrow market lot, but close enough that cameras could capture the wooden stalls and bright piles of vegetables that had suddenly become the center of Atlanta's newest conversation. People still came to buy food, but now they came with curiosity too. Some wanted to see the place everyone was talking about. Some wanted to meet the girl from the videos. Some simply wanted to show support in the quiet ways people sometimes do. Buying an extra bag of tomatoes, lingering longer than usual, offering small smiles that meant more than words. Monica Brooks had already decided she did not like any of it. Attention did not pay rent. Attention did not stop redevelopment contracts. Attention did not protect people when powerful men decided something valuable stood where they wanted to build. She kept working. That was the only answer she trusted. Annie, meanwhile, had noticed something else entirely. People were listening. That part interested her. She sat on her stool with the metal change box open across her knees, counting quarters while a young reporter spoke to Miss Celia near the preserves stand. So you've known Monica for years? The reporter asked. Miss Celia folded her arms, long enough to know that girl earned every ounce of respect that child was talking about. The reporter scribbled something quickly in a notebook. Across the aisle, Annie leaned toward her mother. "Mom." "Yes, baby?" "Why do grown-ups act surprised when someone tells the truth?" Monica paused while weighing a bundle of collard greens. "Because truth is easier to ignore when nobody says it out loud." Annie nodded slowly, filing the answer away. At the edge of the lot, a black sedan pulled quietly to a stop. It was not one of the SUVs from before, and there were no assistants stepping out with folders. Only Edward Whitmore. He stepped from the car alone. For a moment he stood beside the vehicle watching the market. No one had noticed him yet. From a distance, the scene looked ordinary again. Vendors arranging produce, customers chatting, a radio playing something soft and familiar. It was almost easy to forget that the place had become a public argument over land, power, and respect. Almost. Edward walked into the market without announcing himself. The first person to see him was Reverend Pike. The old man tilted his head slightly. "Well," he murmured. "Look who decided to come back without a parade." Edward nodded politely as he passed. "Good morning." The Reverend tapped his cane once against the pavement. "Morning." Miss Celia noticed next. She said nothing, but her eyes followed him carefully. Word spread quickly along the stalls, not through whispers this time, but through the simple shift in attention that moved like wind through tall grass. And then Annie saw him. She stopped counting coins. "Oh," she said. Monica looked up. Edward Whitmore had reached the stall again. But this time there was something different about him. He wasn't carrying the air of inspection. He wasn't scanning the property like a blueprint. He looked thoughtful, which, to Annie, was suspicious. "You came back," she said. Edward glanced at the change box. "You're still working?" "Yes." Annie closed the lid with a quiet click. "So," she said. "Which step are you on now?" Edward raised an eyebrow. "Step? Thinking was step one," Annie reminded him. "Fixing it was step two." A small smile flickered at the corner of Reverend Pike's mouth nearby. Edward looked at Monica. "May I speak with you?" Monica straightened slowly. "You are speaking with me," Edward nodded. "Yes, but I meant privately." Annie leaned forward immediately. "Why?" Edward looked down at her. "Because some conversations require fewer witnesses." Annie shook her head. "Important conversations should have more witnesses." Several vendors nearby nodded quietly. Edward seemed to consider this. Then he looked back at Monica. "You run this stall 6 days a week?" "Yes." "And the market is essential to your income?" "Yes." Edward drew a slow breath. "My company plans to submit a formal acquisition request for this block next month." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Conversation stopped. Even the reporter near Miss Celia lowered her notebook. Annie's hands tightened on the change box. "So you're still planning to tear it down?" she said. Edward did not answer immediately. "That depends on several factors." "Like money," Annie said. "Money is one factor." "And the people here?" Edward looked around the market again. "The stalls, the vendors, the customers who had paused to listen. They are another factor." Annie studied his face carefully. "You're still thinking in rich people sentences," she said. A few quiet laughs escaped nearby. Edward did not appear offended. Instead, he surprised everyone by pulling a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket. He placed it gently on the edge of the vegetable table. Monica frowned slightly. "What is that?" "A proposal." "For what?" Edward met her eyes. "For keeping the market." The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Miss Celia leaned forward so far she nearly knocked over a jar. Reverend Pike blinked slowly. Annie looked from the paper to Edward and back again. "You're serious?" Edward nodded. "There may be a way to develop the surrounding properties while preserving this market." Monica stared at him. "Why?" Edward did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced briefly toward Annie, then back at Monica. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "the numbers on paper are missing part of the equation." Annie leaned closer to the paper but didn't touch it. She looked up at him again. "So, you're trying step two?" Edward allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "I'm trying to." Annie considered this for several seconds. Then she nodded once. "Good." She tapped the change box. "Because step 3 is proving you meant it." Edward looked down at her. "And how would you suggest I do that?" Annie shrugged. "Start by not destroying things people love." The market held its breath again. Edward Whitmore looked around the wooden stalls one more time, and for the first time since the argument began, the future of West End Community Market no longer seemed as certain as it had the week before. The silence after Edward Whitmore placed the folded paper on Monica Brooks's table lasted only a few seconds, but it changed the shape of the morning. Markets were not built for silence. They were built for weighing produce, counting cash, greeting neighbors, calling out prices, and discussing weather, church, and blood pressure with equal seriousness. Silence in a place like West End Community Market meant something had landed hard enough to interrupt life itself. Monica looked down at the paper, but she did not touch it. Annie did, not enough to unfold it. Just one finger against the edge, like she was testing whether it was real. Miss Celia came one careful step closer from her preserve stall. Reverend Pike leaned in on his cane. Two customers who had no reason to stay suddenly developed a deep interest in bell peppers. The young reporter across the aisle looked as though Christmas had arrived early and carrying legal documents. Monica kept her eyes on Edward. "What kind of proposal?" she asked. Edward glanced once around the stall, aware now of every ear within 20 feet. "The kind that requires a proper conversation," he said. Annie frowned. "That sounds like another rich people sentence." A small laugh escaped Reverend Pike before he could stop it. Edward's expression shifted only slightly. "It means I'd rather explain it carefully than badly." Annie considered that. "That is better." Monica still had not touched the paper. "Why now?" she asked. The question was quiet. That made it sharper. Edward held her gaze. "Because I've had time to review the site more completely." Miss Celia folded her arms. "And because a child embarrassed you on camera." Daniel Price, who had just appeared at the edge of the aisle with his tablet in hand, had the sense to remain silent. Edward did not turn toward Miss Celia. "Public attention is part of the situation," he said. "Not all of it." Monica's face gave away nothing, but Annie knew that look. It was the look her mother wore when she was listening very hard and trusting very little. "Read it, Mom," Annie said softly. Monica glanced at her daughter, then at the paper again. Finally, she picked it up and unfolded it. It was only a single page. No glossy rendering, no architectural fantasy full of smiling strangers and impossible sunlight. Just a typed outline, clean and spare. A revised development concept, preservation of the central vendor corridor, infrastructure upgrades funded through adjacent commercial build-out, priority lease protections for existing vendors in good standing, a community board with vendor representation. Monica read it once through, then again, slower. The market had gone quiet all over again. "It's not a contract," Edward said. "It's an alternative framework." Monica looked up, meaning it can still disappear. "It means there is now another option." Annie watched her mother's eyes move over the page. She could tell Monica wanted to believe nothing about this man. It would be safer that way, cleaner, but she could also see something more dangerous creeping in. Hope. Hope was dangerous when you were poor. It made promises feel heavier when they broke. "What's the catch?" Miss Celia asked. Edward answered without irritation. "There isn't one. There's always one," Reverend Pike said mildly. Daniel stepped forward at last. "The complication," he said in the tone of a man trying to prevent a room from becoming a battlefield, "is that this would require internal approval, revised planning, and cooperation from parties who currently prefer the original model." "That's a very tidy way of saying powerful people want the old plan," Miss Celia said. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Monica folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table beside the tomatoes. "You're asking us to trust a possibility." Edward looked at the document, then at her. "I'm saying the original outcome is no longer the only one under consideration." Annie rested both hands on her change box. "That still sounds slippery." This time even Monica almost smiled. Before Edward could answer, a voice cut in from behind him. "Sir." It was Harold Pike. He was walking fast, shoulders tight, a leather folder clamped in one hand. Unlike Daniel, Harold never understood the value of entering a tense situation gently. He came to problems the way men came to fences they intended to kick down. He stopped when he saw the crowd around the stall. His eyes moved from Edward to Monica to Annie, then to the folded page on the table. Something hard flashed across his face. "We need a word," he said. Edward did not move. "You can speak." Harold glanced at the surrounding vendors, clearly disliking the idea of witnesses. "Privately." "No." The word came flat and final. Annie looked up at Monica, as if to say, "See? Important conversations should have witnesses. Harold inhaled slowly through his nose. The city inspector's office has finalized preliminary compliance concerns for several vendor units. Monica's spine stiffened. Daniel looked sharply at Harold. What concerns? Harold opened the folder. Structural hazards, code inconsistencies, unauthorized modifications, sanitation flags. Miss Celia made a sound of disgust. Oh, spare me. Harold ignored her and continued. If the notices go out this week, it will accelerate vacancy. Edward turned his head, very slowly. Accelerate. Harold seemed to realize too late that he had chosen the wrong word. I mean, clarify the urgency of transition. No, Edward said. You meant accelerate. A current passed through the aisle. Everyone felt it. Monica's eyes narrowed. You were planning to force people out. Harold straightened. The property is non-compliant in multiple areas. These vendors are month to month at best. No one is forcing anyone. We are moving within legal channels. Legal, Reverend Pike said quietly, is often the favorite costume of cruelty. Harold looked like a man who considered old pastors one more obstacle between himself and efficiency. Edward held out his hand. Folder. Harold hesitated, then gave it to him. Edward opened it. His eyes moved across the pages quickly, but Annie noticed the change in his face almost at once. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. The unpleasant kind. These notices were drafted yesterday, he said. Yes, sir. And you intended to circulate them without discussing the revised framework. Harold shifted his weight. Because with respect, sir, the revised framework is not practical. Daniel spoke for the first time since Harold arrived. Practical for whom? Harold ignored him and kept his attention on Edward. We're losing momentum already. Media attention has complicated the timeline. If we let community sentiment dictate the process, we'll never close this acquisition cleanly. There it was. Not just the plan, but the philosophy beneath it. Cleanly. As if removing hundreds of ordinary lives from a place they depended on was simply a question of paperwork done efficiently. Monica folded her arms. You were going to send code notices to people who can barely afford lunch and call it procedure. Harold gave her a thin, professional smile. I was going to follow the regulatory path available to us. Annie slid off her stool. She did not come all the way around the stall this time. She just stood beside it, one hand resting on the table near the folded proposal. So that's your trick, she said. Harold looked down at her, already dismissing her. It isn't a trick, little girl. It's business. Annie's eyes sharpened. No, she said. It's hiding meanness inside paperwork. Miss Celia shut her eyes for 1 second as if the child had just spoken for half the market. Harold opened his mouth, but Edward spoke first. Enough. The single word stopped everyone. Edward closed the folder. His voice, when it came again, was quieter than shouting and much more dangerous. No notices go out. Harold stared at him. Sir, no notices, Edward repeated. No pressure tactics. No compliance actions initiated for the purpose of forcing early vacancy. Harold's jaw tightened. That will weaken our position. Edward looked at him fully now. Then perhaps our position deserves weakening. Daniel lowered his eyes, hiding what might have been relief. For a long moment, Harold said nothing. The market waited. Finally, he gave one clipped nod. Understood. But Annie noticed what adults often missed when they were busy winning the main argument. Harold's eyes when he looked at Monica. At the stall, at the gathered vendors. That was not surrender. It was resentment, looking for another road. He turned and walked away without another word. The moment he disappeared down the aisle, the market seemed to exhale all at once. Reverend Pike leaned on his cane and said, Well, that man smiles like a foreclosure notice. Daniel coughed into one hand. Edward handed the folder to him. Review everything, every notice, every internal instruction related to this property. Yes, sir, and find out who authorized this timeline. Daniel took the folder. I will. Edward looked then at Monica and Annie, not as a man surveying a stall, as a man standing in the consequences of his own machinery. Annie rested her hand protectively on the folded proposal. You see, she said, big things do try to crush small ones. Edward nodded once. Yes, it was the first full, uncomplicated agreement he had given her. Monica looked at the proposal. then at the direction Harold had gone, then back at Edward. "If you mean to do this differently, you'd better move faster than the people who don't." Edward's gaze stayed on her. "I intend to." Annie tilted her head. "That means we are now on step 3. Edward almost asked what step 3 was, then stopped himself. He already knew. Prove it. The market did not return to normal after Harold Pike walked away. It tried. People went back to weighing vegetables. Customers picked up tomatoes and cucumbers again. The radio near the honey stand crackled through another gospel song. A breeze lifted the edge of the green awning above Monica's stall, but something in the air had shifted. The argument had stopped being quiet. Monica stood behind the table with both hands resting on the wood. The folded proposal lay beside the basket of tomatoes, and for a moment she simply looked at it as though it might disappear if she blinked. Annie watched Harold's back until he vanished past the bread stall. Then she looked up at Edward Whitmore. "That man is not finished," she said. Edward did not pretend otherwise. "No," he replied. "He isn't." Reverend Pike tapped his cane lightly on the pavement. "Men like that rarely stop when the first door closes." Miss Celia nodded from her preserves table. "They just find another hallway." Daniel stood beside Edward, the folder of compliance notices still in his hand. His face carried the look of someone who had just realized a situation was larger than the job description he had originally accepted. Edward turned to him. "Cancel every notice in that file." Daniel nodded. "I will. And review every document related to this property," Edward continued. "If there are any other creative strategies being prepared, I want to see them." "Yes, sir." Daniel stepped away, already opening the folder. Meanwhile, the young reporter who had been lingering near the preserve stand edged a little closer. Her notebook was already open. "Mr. Whitmore," she said cautiously, "does this mean the redevelopment plan is changing?" Edward looked at her. The market fell quiet again. He could have given the usual answer, something corporate and smooth that meant nothing. Investors preferred those answers. Lawyers depended on them. But Annie was watching him. So was Monica. "Yes," he said finally. The reporter blinked. "Changing how?" Edward gestured toward the folded paper on the table. "We're reviewing an alternative plan that would preserve the market." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the stalls. Miss Celia's eyes widened. Reverend Pike leaned heavily on his cane. "Well now," he said softly. "That's a sentence I didn't expect to hear today." The reporter scribbled furiously. "Is the market protected under this plan?" she asked. "Nothing is finalized," Edward said carefully. "But the intention is to explore development that does not destroy existing community infrastructure." Annie tilted her head. That was still a little rich people sentence. A few people laughed. Edward sighed softly. "It means we are trying to keep the market." "That's better," Annie said. Monica remained quiet through the exchange. Her eyes were still on the folded proposal. "You understand something," she said slowly. Edward turned toward her. "If this goes wrong," she continued, "my daughter and I are the ones who pay for it." The words carried no accusation, only reality. Edward nodded. "I understand. You might lose money," Monica said. "Yes, we lose everything." The market absorbed the sentence like a stone dropped into deep water. Edward held her gaze. "That's why it has to be done right." Annie looked between them. Then she slid off her stool again. Her hand rested on the edge of the table near the proposal. "So what happens next?" Edward considered the question. "Now," he said, "we figure out how to make this plan real." "And Harold?" Edward glanced down the aisle where Harold had disappeared earlier. "He will try something else." Annie nodded. "I thought so." Reverend Pike cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "if this is turning into a fight, you might want witnesses." Miss Celia lifted a jar of preserves like a small declaration. "You've got a few." More vendors nodded. The bread seller, the honey man, the woman who had bought onions earlier that morning. One by one, people moved a little closer to the stall. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to show they were present. Edward Whitmore watched the quiet shift. Community. He had seen the word used in reports, presentations, and marketing campaigns for years, but this was the first time he had seen it behave like a force. Annie looked around at the gathered vendors. Then she looked back at Edward. "You see?" she said. Edward nodded slowly. "Yes." Annie tapped the folded proposal with one finger. "So step 3 starts now." Edward almost smiled. "Yes." At that exact moment, Daniel returned from the edge of the market. His expression had changed. "Sir," he said quietly. Edward turned. Daniel held up his phone. "You should see this." Edward glanced at the screen. His eyes narrowed slightly. The headline on the article read, "City Review requested for West End Market property." Daniel spoke carefully. Harold may not have waited. Edward took the phone and read the article. According to the report, a formal complaint about unsafe vendor structures and regulatory violations had already been submitted to the city planning office, filed anonymously, but the timing was obvious. Reverend Pike watched Edward's face. "Well," the old man said quietly, "looks like the hallway showed up faster than expected." Monica exhaled slowly. "So that's the next move." Annie folded her arms, trying to close the market with paperwork. Edward handed the phone back to Daniel. "Yes." For a moment no one spoke. Then Annie said something that made several people blink. "That's okay." Edward looked down at her. "Why?" Annie shrugged. "Because the truth is stronger than paperwork." The market went quiet again. Edward Whitmore studied the small girl standing beside the vegetable stall, and for the first time since the battle had begun, he realized something important. Harold Pike might understand money, but Annie Brooks understood people, and in a fight about a place like this, people were the only numbers that really mattered. By Thursday morning, the fight for West End Community Market was no longer quiet. The city planning office had confirmed the complaint. Inspection requests had been logged, regulatory reviews had been scheduled, and word had spread that the market might be forced to shut down temporarily while safety concerns were evaluated. Nobody at the market believed the timing was accidental. Monica arrived earlier than usual that morning. The sky was still gray when she unlocked the back of her van and began unloading crates of vegetables. The air smelled like damp pavement and early coffee drifting from the diner down the street. Annie sat on the edge of the tailgate, swinging her legs while watching her mother work. "Mom," she said quietly. "Yes, baby. Are they going to close the market?" Monica lifted a crate of tomatoes and set it on the table. "I don't know yet." Annie frowned slightly. "I don't like not knowing." Monica wiped her hands on her apron. "Neither do I." A few minutes later, Reverend Pike arrived earlier than usual too. He leaned on his cane beside the stall and nodded toward the quiet rows of tables. "I figured folks might need company today." Monica gave a tired smile. "You're not wrong." By the time the sun rose above the buildings, nearly every vendor had arrived early. Miss Celia set out her preserves without her usual humming. Mr. Halverson arranged honey jars with more force than necessary. The bread seller carried trays from his truck and muttered under his breath about city nonsense. The market looked the same as always, but the mood felt like the morning before a storm. Around 8 o'clock, a white city vehicle pulled into the lot. The logo of the Atlanta Department of Buildings was printed on the door. 2 inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards. Conversations stopped. Annie looked at Monica. "That was fast." Monica nodded once. "Yes, it was." The inspectors began walking slowly through the stalls. They looked at tables. They examined wooden frames. They made notes on their clipboards. None of the vendors interfered. They simply watched. When the inspectors reached Monica's stall, one of them cleared his throat politely. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," Monica replied. "We're conducting a preliminary safety review." "I heard." The inspector nodded. He checked the table supports, examined the wooden beams of the stall, and made a few notes. Annie leaned closer to the change box. "Are we in trouble?" she whispered. Monica squeezed her shoulder gently. "Not yet." Across the market, another black car pulled into the lot. This one Annie recognized immediately. Edward Whitmore stepped out, but this time, he was not alone. Daniel walked beside him carrying a thick folder, and 2 additional people followed behind them, both wearing professional suits but not the corporate look Annie had seen before. One of them carried a large blueprint tube. Reverend Pike noticed them first. "Well now," he murmured. Edward walked directly toward the inspectors. "Good morning," he said. The inspectors turned. "Mr. Whitmore," one of them replied. Edward nodded. "I understand you received a complaint." "Yes, sir." "Before you continue," Edward said calmly, "I'd like to introduce the structural engineer who reviewed this property last night." He gestured toward the man carrying the blueprint tube. The engineer stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Lawrence Reed," he said. "Licensed structural engineer. I performed a full overnight inspection of the vendor structures." The city inspector frowned slightly. "Overnight?" "Yes." The engineer opened the tube and unrolled a large set of diagrams across the nearest table. Every stall has been evaluated for load-bearing safety and structural integrity. The inspector leaned down to examine the documents. "And?" he asked. Dr. Reed tapped the blueprint. "They're stable." The market went silent. The inspector flipped through the pages. "These certifications are legitimate?" Daniel spoke up. "Stamped and filed with the city database at 6 this morning." The inspector looked again at the diagrams. "And the sanitation complaints?" Edward gestured toward the second professional standing beside him. A woman stepped forward. "Environmental compliance consultant," she said. She opened a binder. "All sanitation conditions meet temporary vendor regulations. We documented and corrected minor issues overnight." Miss Celia whispered under her breath. "Lord have mercy." The inspector slowly closed his clipboard. "Well," he said after a moment, "that certainly changes things." Annie looked up at Edward. "You moved fast." Edward glanced down at her. "You told me step 3 was proving it." Annie nodded slowly. "Yes." Across the lot, Harold Pike stepped out of a black sedan. He had clearly not expected what he was seeing. His eyes moved from the inspectors to the engineers, to Edward standing calmly beside Monica's stall. The look on his face was tight. He walked quickly toward the group. "What is going on here?" he demanded. Edward didn't raise his voice. "We're correcting the situation." Harold gestured toward the inspectors. "You were supposed to—" The inspector cut him off politely. "Actually, sir, the structures appear to be compliant." Harold froze. "Compliant?" "Yes." The engineer tapped the blueprint again. "Perfectly safe." For a moment, Harold looked like a man whose carefully arranged chessboard had been flipped over. Annie watched him closely. Then she leaned toward her mother. "Step 3, she whispered. Monica squeezed her shoulder. "Yes." Harold turned to Edward. "You're undermining the project." Edward met his gaze calmly. "No, I'm fixing it." The inspectors began packing up their clipboards. "Looks like there's nothing further for us to review today," one of them said. The city vehicle pulled away 15 minutes later. The market slowly began breathing again. Miss Celia raised both hands in the air. "Well, I'll be," Reverend Pike chuckled. "Looks like somebody tried to shut the door and found out the lock had been changed." Harold said nothing, but the anger in his eyes made one thing very clear. The fight was not finished. Annie looked up at Edward Whitmore. "You're getting better at step 3. Edward allowed himself a small smile. "Thank you." Annie tilted her head. "But we still have step 4. Edward blinked. "Step 4? "Yes." She tapped the proposal on the table. "Winning." The market erupted into laughter, and for the first time since the battle began, the people of West End Community Market felt something stronger than fear. They felt momentum. The following Monday, the hearing room at Atlanta City Hall was fuller than usual. City council meetings were rarely crowded unless a road was being renamed or taxes were being raised. Most people preferred to argue about policy online rather than sit through 3 hours of municipal procedure under fluorescent lights. But this meeting was different. Word had spread that the future of West End Community Market would be discussed. So people came. Vendors arrived early, still wearing work shirts that smelled faintly of produce and sun. Customers who had shopped there for years took seats along the back wall. A few reporters set up cameras near the aisle. Miss Celia sat in the second row holding a jar of strawberry preserves like a quiet symbol of the place they were defending. Reverend Pike sat beside her, cane resting across his knees, and Annie sat between her mother and Edward Whitmore. She had never been inside City Hall before. "It smells like old books," she whispered. Monica leaned closer. "That's government." At the front of the room, council members shuffled papers and adjusted microphones. The chairwoman tapped the gavel once. "We will now address agenda item 14, she said. Proposed redevelopment review for the West End Community Market property. A quiet murmur moved through the room. A city planner stepped to the podium and began presenting the original redevelopment proposal. Large screens displayed architectural renderings of a sleek commercial complex, glass storefronts, modern walkways, outdoor seating areas, and landscaped courtyards. The presentation was professional, clean, impressive. But Annie frowned. "Where's the market?" she whispered. Monica squeezed her hand gently. "That's the problem." The planner finished speaking. "This development is projected to bring new retail investment, increase tax revenue, and modernize the surrounding district." The chairwoman nodded. "Thank you." She looked down the list. "Next, we will hear from Mr. Edward Whitmore." Edward stood. The room grew quieter. He walked to the podium and set a folder down. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked out across the room, not at the council members first, at the people sitting behind them, the vendors, the customers. Annie, when my company first reviewed this property, Edward began, we saw land. His voice was calm but carried easily through the chamber. Square footage, traffic potential, retail projections. He paused. That's how development usually works. Several council members nodded slightly. But something happened last week, he continued. Edward glanced toward Annie. A conversation forced me to look again. The room followed his gaze. Annie blinked but didn't hide. Edward continued. I realized we had made a very common mistake. He lifted the folder. We measured the value of the land. Then he lowered it again. But we forgot to measure the value of the people. The room grew still. Edward opened the folder and handed copies of a new document to the council clerk. My company is withdrawing the original demolition proposal. A wave of surprise moved through the chamber. The chairwoman leaned forward. You're withdrawing it? Yes. Edward nodded. In its place, we are submitting a revised development plan that preserves the West End community market. The large screen behind him changed. A new set of plans appeared. The market remained in the center of the property. Instead of removing it, the surrounding area had been redesigned. Improved infrastructure, updated walkways, new lighting, small storefronts built around the market, rather than over it. The council members leaned closer to examine the design. Edward spoke again. This plan invests in the neighborhood without erasing the people who built it. He paused. And it turns out something else happens when you listen to a 6-year-old. A few people laughed softly. You learn that progress doesn't mean replacing people, Edward said. It means building something better with them. The room remained silent for a moment. Then Reverend Pike began clapping. Slowly, one clap at a time. Miss Celia joined him, then the vendors, then the customers. Within seconds, the entire back half of the chamber was applauding. Even a few council members smiled. The chairwoman raised the gavel. Order, please. But her expression was warm. We will review the revised proposal. She looked down at the plans again. Personally, she added, I think it's a very interesting solution. The meeting continued with technical discussion, but the outcome was already clear. An hour later, the council voted. The revised plan passed unanimously. The West End community market would stay. Outside City Hall, sunlight poured across the steps. Reporters gathered. Cameras flashed. Vendors hugged each other. Miss Celia wiped tears from her eyes while pretending she had something in them. Reverend Pike leaned on his cane and smiled. Edward stepped outside beside Monica and Annie. The crowd slowly spread across the plaza. Annie looked up at him. So, she said. Edward raised an eyebrow. So? That was step 4. Edward almost laughed. Winning? Yes. She nodded seriously. You did okay. Monica shook her head with a smile she couldn't hide. Only Annie would grade a billionaire. Edward looked down at the girl standing beside him. You started this, he said. Annie shrugged. I just said the truth. Edward nodded slowly. Yes, he said. You did. A breeze moved across the steps. Below them, the city moved on as it always did. But somewhere across Atlanta, the small wooden stalls of West End Community Market were still standing. And that afternoon, when Monica and Annie returned to their stall, Annie climbed onto her stool, opened the metal change box, and announced to the first customer of the day, "Welcome back." Then she looked toward the aisle where Edward Whitmore had once stood criticizing her mother, and she added with quiet satisfaction, "Extra tomatoes today." Because sometimes justice did not arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrived in a market stall, carried by a child brave enough to speak when everyone else stayed quiet. This story reminds us that courage and truth do not depend on age, wealth, or status. Sometimes the clearest voice in a complicated world comes from someone who simply refuses to accept injustice. Annie showed that respect is not something earned through money or power, but through hard work, kindness, and the way we treat other people. The story also teaches that real progress should never come at the cost of destroying communities or silencing the people who built them. When ordinary people stand together and speak honestly, even the most powerful systems can change. In the end, the greatest lesson is simple. One brave voice can awaken the conscience of many, and sometimes that is enough to begin making the world fairer. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.